Hi, my name is Ron Bettag. I am a member of the LaRouche organization. I just moved to the Houston area along with my wife Diane, and we'll be working with Keisha and the whole dynamic down here to lead the fight to actually build LaRouche's four-law solution into the country. Obviously here, Houston's the center of the NASA component of that, but it's directly relates to the physical economy across the country, the scientific drivers, whether or not we come back to an American system ourselves and actually do what immediately is in front of the entire world. And I think if people were on the nationwide webcast last night, the situation with the Deutsche Bank situation right now in Europe, in Germany in particular, marks the immediate concrete situation where what we're going to discuss today, the four laws, has to be applied immediately in that economy and actually bring LaRouche's insight of a Hamiltonian system, a Leibnizian system which created the United States, back into reality. It's already being moved on by the BRICS nations around the world. Obviously, Europe and the United States has to join that. And this immediate international mobilization to reorganize Deutsche Bank, in Lynn's call for a bailout, a one-time bailout of that, is to basically take it back, reorganize it in a bankruptcy form so that the structure itself can be used for this application of credit for development. Because as we'll discuss today, the real issue in economy is not money. The real issue is the physical economy. What is your measure? What is going on in the economy of labor? Is your labor force, as Mr. LaRouche has been laying out for decades, is the relative potential population density, is that moving up, or are you looting that? And if you look around the world today, we're at the boundary condition now with a crash factor, the blowout factor. Whether you look at the bail-ins, the bailouts, the looting of the population, we're now in a situation where that has to be reversed. And in Germany's situation, it's got to be reversed immediately, because not to reverse it will blow out Germany and we'll get a war and a thermonuclear war. So this supersedes a lot of incredible developments that have taken place in the last hours. We've got the release of the 28 pages. We've got Glass-Steagall more and more the subject in both parties of the policy fight. And so we have accomplished a lot, and it's been developing in that form since almost 2 years ago now, with the BRICS arrangement forming, and we have an alternative before the world that actually can take down this whole British Empire. And obviously, if we measure from that top-down situation, that's exactly why the war drive is on. Terrorism, which is irregular warfare, is escalating, and it brings us right to the point where these policies that we've been fighting for, including the removal of Obama, have to be implemented immediely. And the emergency programs are there, the political situations are shifting, and we've got to pull that off in the next hours and days. The way, this is the first time for one of these meetings myself, the way I'd like to do it is more of a discussion on some key concepts. I don't know if people saw the different presentations like the Thursday night call or the discussion last night with Helga, and we can go into all of that. The question on the economy, I think, and there's just a lot of material that people should really have some fun. If you haven't read them before, study LaRouche and this man's ideas, because the same way Leibniz affected the entire world, Hamilton adopted that and affected the creation of the United States and the fight to maintain that. Both in this particular textbook, which is translated all around the world, and the other economics books, Lynn walks people through all these concepts. And although we look at some of these things and we think of economy in terms of money, these dynamics of a physical economy, in fact, in this particular book, Lynn gets to chapter 7 before he even mentions money, and then he says to approach the question of money is like putting your pants on, starting by putting it over your head first and then trying to adjust your legs. It has really very little function except as a tool in directing credit and things. So just to start this question on the 4 laws, as I don't know if you want to put that up now, but 4 laws, as Lynn points to, as the only laws that can function are first Glass-Steagall, national banking, credit for jobs, and then fusion energy. And if you look at this Deutsche Bank situation, in terms of Glass-Steagall, as we're putting forth in the United States, Glass-Steagall immediately makes the decision between the 2 types of banking systems. The very first known writing on economy was Genesis, and the question of be fruitful, multiply, subdue, and develop the earth. It's that relationship of the human mind to the productive reality, expanding and developing human productivity. Any approach to economics that doesn't deal at that level is not going to last very long. You have Leibniz writes society and economy, and you have the first approach to a physical approach to science, to economy, is work, power, and technology. These relationships of man applying himself to the universe. And we can go through some of those in different levels. This is where Hamilton picks it up and writes in the reports on the subject of manufacturing. So the American system of that vectored credit, as opposed to a British system, what Roosevelt did when he reinstated Glass-Steagall is he made that separation so you can actually go back to the government itself controlling the economy. So in the Deutsche Bank situation, as LaRouche just called for, we've got to draw that line. But to do that next step, the national banking, you have to have a facility that you can use. Like Hamilton, Lincoln created the greenback policy, or Roosevelt had the Reconstruction program. In Germany today, the only structure that can play that role is the Deutsche Bank, which has been taken over since Herrhaus's execution when the wall came down. And that bank has now got to be used as the vehicle. So what Lynn is calling for is a singular bailout of that bank, but under certain criteria where the credit is run specifically, as he says in the 3rd point, into these creations of jobs, creations of infrastructure, these vector technologies like fusion, a lot of what the BRICS nations are already doing. So you've got, not only that stability set up to avoid a collapse into war if you don't do it immediately, because you have Germany on a situation where if we crash there, you'll break the ability of Germany to function. Germany is the last place in Europe that has an ability. If you look at Italy, if you look at Portugal, if you look at Spain, there is no capability left to restart the physical economy at a big enough level to actually solve it. So you got to do it in Germany. You got to do it with the structures you can actually use that the population will follow. So we come back to this, break this story out on the Herrhausen assassination and what actually caused this collapse. We can actually use that to turn the entire situation. And then, as we'll talk about in the relative potential population density, the only way any of this works is if you're increasing the rate at which your population can do that. So it's only the move to the next level of technologies, the next levels of singularities, not only in terms of what you can do with your economy, but what you're going to have in terms of equality of people. And so the drivers for thermonuclear fusion, as Keisha's leading here in Houston for the whole nation, the reactivation of NASA. This is now not an academic discussion. It's an emergency movement. And what's interesting, the same way Mr. LaRouche has looked at himself as these historical figures, as a world historic individual, what really lands in our lap, to the degree that we have stayed awake in this situation, we have that world historic role ourselves. Whether or not we now create the conditions to cause this shift to be affected or not is really in our situation, in our power to do. And to understand this, why don't we just rationally move on this? What is the fight? Obviously, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a massive fight right now underway to stop this. There's been a massive fight to stop, LaRouche even being a subject in the human population in terms of the blackout, the jailings, the attempted assassinations as well. You see, when the Berlin Wall came down and these potential programs were on the table with our, triangular program and Herrhausen coming to the United States, immediately within days he's assassinated, and you have the threats that lock this thing, back up in a controlled form. So if you look, you have in Hamilton, you have the American system. Immediately when the United States is set up, you have Wealth of Nations, you have Adam Smith, you have all these layers around the British East India Company that go to work to stop that. By the time you have the 1815 period and Treaty of Vienna, you have these the only two significant approaches to economy are squared off, these doctrines of economy. One, the British system, the looting system, and then this American system of credit. And the reason I refer to the books is Lynn walks people through this, this political fight. You get to the Species of Resumption in 1878, after the Civil War, this political fight, they demand all the debts of the United States from the Civil War to be paid immediately. And it immediately creates the crisis, with Lincoln already out of the picture, John Jay out of the picture. You have a situation where they caused the crisis, the panic of 1907, and then they slammed in the Federal Reserve. So you have various kinds of fights, and you have what Roosevelt did to win, World War II and these kind of things. But the overall structure has never been broken. It's been this parallel situation. So I wanted to do two things and then come back to the graphs on the financial crash, because if we look at these notions that Leibniz brought up in terms of what economy is as opposed to paper and money. He said power, work, and technology. And it's these relations of man's applications of power to do work and the ability to even affect that, the higher levels of that affected by different technologies. One example was the beginning use around that time of the steam engine. The use of coal, the use of, you needed pumps to deal with the water in the mines. It was applications of that gave us a steam engine to actually make the whole society mobile. But the ongoing discussion and applications of these ideas, as opposed to what we get every morning, turn on the radio and you got a reading of what happened on the stock market, did it go up or go down? It's a gambling casino as opposed to a real economy. And so if you look at this question of technologies and how one approach shifts the technology, you could do more work with less application of energy. The changes in the energy flux density, the changes of the ability of man to actually affect what's going on. This is measured by the technological improvements. And you have these, again, it's directly related to these philosophical concepts of least action and man's ability to intervene in society. There was one section here I wanted to read on just briefly. This is, the first measure of the effect of machine design is comparison of the human effort required to operate the machine and the amount of work accomplished by the operator employing the machine. If the machine is powered by means other than human muscle effort, we must measure the cost of producing the animal power, the water power, the wind power, the heater power in terms of the human effort in society to organize that power, to deliver such power to the machine. So it's an entire dynamic as opposed to what you make on it, how much profit did you make? And he says, this latter we may view as the capital cost of supplying the power. We must then compare changes in the ratio of capital costs and these operatives associated with the use of that particular class of machinery, which changes the rate of the work output by the operative employing the machine. So the real measure of an economy is not money. The real measure is this the economy of labor. What is the quality of the labor force? And obviously, if you look at today, with the looting of the labor force, the breakdown society, the health system, the drug situation, you see we're looting everything. So if you want to put the first slide up. I can come back to this. This is just really quickly. This is just the derivatives. If you look at the rate of paper to what I was just saying in the real economy, we have, look at the rate of actual fictitious debt derivatives and stocks, which really have nothing to do in terms of whether you're going to produce something at all. You can go to the next one. It's another kind of indication. If you look at the top graph, these are the derivatives with various banks. Mostly U.S. banks here. But if you look at the bottom, look at the derivatives, the 708 trillion in derivatives, and then you have there's a global output of GDP that's only 70. That's the entire world physical economy, adjusted for speculation and things. You come over here to the third last one, you have the fourth last one, the U.S. annual GDP, 15. So you look at this paper gap. Now, if we go to the next one, you'll see what it's actually caused.
This is for this year?
No, this is a few years ago, but it's basically worse now. Even with the situation in 2008, where they said they saved and dealt with all the banks, it's actually at least twice as bad.
It's $2.2 quadrillion.
China's GDP has grown, isn't it past the United States now? This is the world's most productive.
Oh, yeah. Now, this is LaRouche's famous triple curve. The bottom curve is what we just looked at in terms of the physical economy, the actual real production that's going on, the standard of living, the labor force, its abilities, the potential and energy, the health standards of the society. And in the United States, we're actually collapsing at rates as fast as Russia collapsed with the fall of the Soviet Union, when you had literally within a number of years, the life expectancy of males actually had dropped 10 years of expectation. It's a similar reflection in terms of the quality of work, in terms of the drug situation, everything else, just the lack of any kind of education of the youth. The other two graphs represent, one, as it says, the financial aggregates, and then these money aggregates that are being pumped in. What you have in both situations, you see the line being drawn where now we've crossed the point of no return. The earlier triple curve, if you remember, those two other graphs at the top were going up. They were actually pumping money in, the hyperinflation, and the aggregates will continue to increase. We're already past the point where, with both the bail-ins and the bail-outs, you're lessening the value of the money. You can't solve it. We're already beyond the point unless you get rid of the whole system. And that's exactly where we are in Germany with the Deutsche Bank, because now in terms of the physical and military and social reality of that, you got to use Deutsche Bank right now to make that turn. You've got to freeze that upper two curves and immediately use a reorganized Deutsche Bank to invest in that lower level, turning that up the other direction. And that's the political fight. The British and the Empire faction would like to blow it out, cause a war like they did in World War I, and then under the cover of that war, dump a lot of that top debt, but be in a position to maintain the control of the credit. And Lynn has been unique on the scene, saying we're going to get to this point, and it's exactly, in turning it, you can actually get to a situation where you set the entire paper value in a bankruptcy and put yourself in a position to vector the credit that produces the wealth to turn this around. Ian, you want to jump to that?
Next one.
And this then would be a scientific, real economy where what you're putting your money into, like the Chinese are doing today, best example, basically leads a physical development, not only of China, but the entire world. So you're investing in infrastructure, you're investing in power systems, you're investing in transportation systems, and your investment actually leads the fight. It leads the real physical economy. And you've basically, as you see, there's no triple curve here, because what some people are kind of scared about, if you bail out Deutsche Bank, then you're still going to have that. You're reinforcing that network. But with a scientifically government-controlled bankruptcy reorganization, as LaRouche is calling for in the Deutsche Bank situation, and for all of Europe, and this is what Glass-Steagall would do in the United States, it would put us back in a position to do this. We'd put that hundreds and quadrillions of paper derivative bubble, in a bankruptcy reorganization situation, and it and the Federal Reserve would never come out of that situation. You'd write it off. It's basically bogus from the beginning. And so if you want to go to the next one. I put this in just in terms of, if you look how many mistakes we're making, if you look at all this focus on solar energy, as you see, well, that's a real economy. But if you look, the actual sun hits the earth at, what is it, 2 millions.
It's 200 watts per second.
Yeah, 200 watts per second. Fossil fuels jumps up a bit, fusion energy, and then you have the, what we actually move to with thermonuclear fusion. You see the power that you get in terms of energy flux density relative to your investment, like we're talking about with the machines earlier, your higher levels of this. If you look at the second table, you have the oil capital cost, or the cost for to actually apply it, and you see that we're actually operating everything at a net loss, and we've got to literally face those facts and make the shift, not gradually inch our way back to something else, but exactly as Keisha is leading the fight. We have to immediately reactivate NASA to understand this mission and not look at it as a club or some kind of private operation. Now let's kind of practically get what we can. We have to fundamentally cause a revolution to the same kind of policy in the United States. And I think the next slide is a picture of a fusion design for a rocket, propulsion system. And you get into situations like we mentioned briefly, and I like to get a discussion going rather than just talk, but you have these discussions of, manned trips to Mars. Well, if you put a man on the rocket here right now and send him out there chemically, it takes like 8 months to get out, and you'll never get him back. If you go to a thermonuclear fusion, it's estimated that you could go, in terms of one gravitational force, you create the gravity as you go, you would have you alleviate that problem. You could actually get out there in a week or a bit more. So you're totally changing, again, man's relationship to time and space, which is the real question of economy. It's the human mind. It's this application of human and the increase of human labor and its potential. And then obviously if we go to the next slide, the last one, this is our subject, and not just the subject on the Earth. We have an entire solar system to master and make the breakthroughs to then start dealing with the complexity of the galaxies. But rather than, what I wanted to do with this, and what I think people have to understand, is this four-law solution is grounded in some key notions. This notion of physical economy versus speculation in paper. It's based in this notion of energy flux density. What is the quality of the work that you're doing, and then this question of the human mind really being the subject here, and how do we create again the ability that we become citizens to actually pull this off, not immediately only in Germany, which is our front line as well right now, but also then use that as a flank to change the United States. So I don't know if people have read a bit on these questions of just on the economy, on energy flux density and these kinds of things. What is Lynn actually talking about? Again, how was he uniquely the individual in the world who said save Deutsche Bank when everybody else is either saying bail them out or let the banks go under? It's Lynn again is totally outside the two sides of the orchestrated fight. And I don't know if people have a question. Yeah.
Can you give a little bit? I mean, people should go and look at Helga's webcast last night, but maybe a little bit of the history around what Lynn was calling for in 88, 89, prior to the death of Harryhausen, or assassination of Harryhausen, rather, just in terms of the relevance of why he can uniquely call for what he's calling for today.
Helga went through this on the webcast last night extensively, but in people know the Berlin Wall, as the Russian situation, the Soviet Union crashed, the Berlin Wall came down. Now, again, uniquely was the individual a year prior to that had laid out that these physical dynamics that were bringing down Russia were creating a situation where not only would the Soviet Union fall, creating a situation for a reunified Europe, but that we should move, and he said this, like I said, a year before it actually happened, that we should, rather than have that take the world into a panic, we should work with Russia, take Poland as an example, and use the development of Poland not only to stabilize the situation there in all of Europe, but actually give Russia an example of what they could do as well, and move to this kind of physical economy. And he was calling on all the background that was there in Russia, collaborating and working with the United States for decades. I mean, they were allies with us in the American Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War. So again, flank this British operation and put that kind of design on the table. When the Berlin Wall fell, this fellow Harryhausen was the head of Deutsche Bank, and he had collaboration with us before that. He was the chief advisor of Kohl. So there was factions in Germany actually moving in this direction. And Harryhausen himself was coming to the United States, having given a couple of speeches already, to do exactly this. Use Deutsche Bank for these vectored credits, writing off a lot of the third world debt and other things, and move at that point to pull about this kind of shift we just talked about. And he was then, 4 days before he gave that speech, he was assassinated when his car was blown up in Europe. You know, Lynn was already in jail in this situation. So you see how the enemy moved immediately to use not only that kind of an assassination, but the operation through Mitterrand in France, Thatcher in England, George Bush Sr. here, to set up this whole structure, which became the Euro, the Maastricht agreements, and all these kinds of things. So a potential that would have moved on Lynn's triangular program back then got sabotaged with that assassination. The same way in the United States, Kennedy and others were moving with the NASA, the Apollo program and others for development. And with the taking out of the Kennedys, the British effectively derailed that. And not that there weren't forces that didn't understand that, none of it consolidated itself effectively to become the power. Like in Germany, with Harryhausen out, Kohl capitulating a bit, and we've got a film out that's linked to this you can look at it, the lost chance of 1989. This potential was there, and they again successfully sabotaged it. So at Lynn, looking at this situation now with Deutsche Bank in this crisis, where if you let them consolidate it and bail out the bank at this point, and not bail out the bank, but maintain the system, then you will get a collapse of Germany, no ability to change it there. You'll get a war like the British orchestrated, World War I and World War II. I mean, another good thing people might look at is when Lincoln, although the British assassinated him, Lincoln's policy for building rail lines across the country here had been picked up in Russia coming out of the big, conferences and conventions in the United States. So Russia was moving through a transcontinental rail line. China and the Orient Express, some of the developments of the Berlin-Baghdad rail lines. So imagine with the same kind of unity and development that was taking place already in the United States, basically now vying for power and more powerful than the British Empire, they're moving into the turn of the century. What if the whole Eurasian landmass, Russia and Eurasia, like we're talking about today with the BRICS program, what if that would have gone the same direction of the United States? What would have happened to the British control of development? So they had to stop that, and they say publicly that was their policy, and they orchestrated World War I, and World War II is a similar kind of extension of that, but to break that up, and they successfully did it. So when Lynn looks at these things, he sees that whole history, and as you see the thing coming down now, looking at the dynamic in Germany, Europe and the United States have to join the BRICS, or you'll get this square off in a fight, and it'll be a thermonuclear fight. So Lynn's call for the Deutsche Bank of Herrhausen to be reset up, scrapping the paper structure, use that as a tool to shift it catalytically. And we're putting that out as a national call to shift it there and as well in the United States, because there's really one fight for this human system.
Is this something that Germany can do on their own, or do they have to go through the European Union?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they have to actually break from the European Union and establish sovereignty. It's really a question of sovereignty. Like in the United States, the removal of Obama is a question of sovereignty. You have to actually decide to run your own country, because you have to be qualified to run it at the level it's going to run.
I mean, do we have to have a referendum and removal of Germany first in order to put this through the bank? Or?
Well, I think what we've got in the German situation with Deutsche Bank publicly demanding a bailout, they need 150 billion immediately. It's a daily demand. So there is going to be an emergency program. What we have to do is politically control that emergency program. So it speaks directly to the point of why more people have to be political in real terms. They have to understand what is real political economy. It's not economy and politics, and you pick which ball team you like or which shortstop you like. The question is really these more profound questions, because the question is, do you have the capability left to reorganize it at a broad enough scope to affect the whole change? It's like Roosevelt did with the investments of credits into the Tennessee Valley Authority, the bridges and whatever. You have to create a situation where you can pull the population in on it. It's like in the United States, you got to bring the youth into the CCC kind of program, vector the credit. And the first question always is, where are you going to get the money? Well, you create the policy in the program by your own intention, and you're going to build what you need, which is going to retire the paper. So it's really more people understanding that real political role. And so I think if you have a dynamic in this emergency in Germany that moves now, as Helga's put the call out, to move on this remembrance of Herrhausen, solve that problem, like we're doing in the United States, especially in Manhattan, on the question of the 28 pages. 15 years of 3,000 people murdered and not dealt with. But it's got a residence quality that you can actually move people to think at a different level because of the emergency.
For example, there wasn't a referendum in Germany when the wall came down.
Oh,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, can we do this?
Ron, so it's not that Germany needs to push to get out of the EU, it's first that it needs to push to own and operate with the Herrenhausen policies, the Deutsche Bank, that would actually cause a break with the EU.
What if the EU joined them and we went the other direction? It's, right.
Yeah, because you're clashing with the policies. So if you're demanding that, then you're essentially saying, well, sorry, we don't really want to go along with the EU anymore.
Yeah, yeah, the particular structures are secondary to what is the content of what you're doing.
What is the
Right.
content? Yeah, I like that example of the wall. They didn't vote on that.
Yes, they did, with their feet.
Yeah, right.
And their pickaxes.
And started out with candlelight vigils and.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, we were in the middle of that at the highest levels. We were discussing directly with the coal government, like we talked about with Herrenhausen and others. And the problem is really evident there where you have this kind of potential, and that's what's really excellent about this film that we put out, The Lost Chance. There was no political individual or structure that, if they were ready or not to move, they didn't move, where they could have actually caused this to become policy. You know, seized the initiative and blocked an ability for the British to pull off this Mitterrand, George Bush operation, both from the German side and from the United States side. I mean, we really acted quite stupid as the United States in that situation as well.
Well, who were the traders in Germany that went along with Mitterrand and Bush?
Wolfgang Schubert
Wow.
was the interior minister.
Schubert.
Finance minister.
Sure, though, at that time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other very interesting things about that period, Helga mentioned last night that Kohl, 2 days before Herrenhausen's assassination, had laid out a comprehensive 10-point program for the new economic agenda for the country. And, after Herrenhausen's assassination, I think it was within another year, Detlef Rohrabacher, who was the head of the economic reconstruction of East Germany, he was also assassinated. I mean, so you had here a leader who was being, the head of Germany, Kohl, who probably no one outside of Helga, actually could provide him, some sense of the reality of what was going on. And, his top people were assassinated, within 12, maybe it was a little more months than that. And the whole, as she goes through, Germany was forced by France and Thatcher to adopt the euro, which Germany knew would destroy its economy. So this is, Germany was an occupied country all the way from the end of World War II. They finally, got an opportunity, and then it was destroyed. And it's, it's an amazing flank that Lynn has developed around this, because obviously if this were to happen, if we were to get this movement with Deutsche Bank, it would spread, because, you'd have bankers everywhere recognizing this is the way out. There's been no credit inside Germany, like in the United States, for medium or small enterprises for decades now. And everything is just collapsing in terms of the real source of productive economic activity. So.
Yeah, I think we're really, just the rate that terrorism is being used, and people in this situation begin understanding, look at these surgical assassinations. It's irregular warfare. It's not trying to figure out in some kind of phenomenon, copycat. there might be some of that at the bottom, but it's really a deployment from the top. And when you were saying about, I was just thinking of Syria, for example, Assad moving on the development program with the seas. You see key situations where, and then you have that being attacked, or a Gaddafi moving with all these other problems, moving to counter the development of ISIS and all this, and you have this potential wrecked and then use it for more destabilization. What Lynn is always saying is you have to think about these things from the top. You have to understand this empire battle versus this nation state. You have to understand this human mind, man's application of his own power over the universe, which is really what's the science of economics. It's the science of the future right now, whether we're going to actually continue it. But that kind of fight or outlook versus this empire, which is desperately now today, but most of the time, if they're not in this kind of situation, arrogantly deployed to make sure that anything like this or potential like this gets taken out. The unique difference they have today is they're in a situation where the alternative is out of their control. They didn't consolidate fascism in the United States in the 9/11 attempts. So on all these fronts, especially right now in Germany, there is the potential, if we move effectively as a catalyst and define the real issue, you can have more and more people come in behind this as a consent of the governed. Like they did on Lincoln's policy.
Ron, it's important not to use the word bailout, right? I mean, you don't want to confuse people, right? So it's, is the proper term or concept that we could be using with the proper word recapitalize?
Well, it's basically what Lynn's always calls a bankruptcy on this whole structure. They're already bankrupt. It's not a matter of how do we have to prove their bankruptcy. I mean, look at those figures, from the derivatives versus the real economy. It's really nothing. People know it. The American people know it. We were pumping in $85 billion a month for how many months, right? It's not like people don't know this. It's a perception of themselves and their question of whether they can actually do something about it. And I think what we've accomplished on a couple of fronts the last couple of days, or indications of those kinds of battles and issues that are moving, but you've got to actually, as Lynn said to us at one point, if you're not expanding, if you're not accelerating, then you're already losing, because it's precisely, and the use of the term, we've got to get to a point where people understand what we're talking about. We're not talking about bailing out the derivatives. We're talking about using a structure to go back to a physical economy. But that means you have to bail out that structure. You can't let that structure go on.
I thought we don't use that term. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But by bailing out the structure, he means you've got to, Deutsche Bank is the largest commercial bank in Germany. And I think it's not a commercial bank around the world. It's just an investment bank elsewhere. So, what Lynn is looking at is how do we save that physical economy of Germany, which is, and it's, in spite of its contraction, still the biggest economic power in Europe, and has the greatest potential to affect the whole area, the whole region, the whole continent of Eurasia. So if you, what he's saying is you have to recapitalize that banking infrastructure to be able to start extending credit into the productive economy of the area. And so, in a sense, it's like doing a Glass-Steagall for Deutsche Bank, in a sense. That's how I kind of see it. So.
And if you look at what the government has in terms of their own assets, there's nothing can deal with the size of the problem that's hitting them. You've got to go to this higher level where you basically create what you need. And in the physical economy, you have to pay for it yourself over time. People still ask you all the time, well, for example, with Roosevelt, and you ask them, well, where did Roosevelt get the money to do the Tennessee Valley Authority? What did the Tennessee Valley Authority cost us? Right? If you want to think, it's a wrong concept, because what we produced isn't even, comparable. What did the Hoover Dam cost us? Well, we're brainwashed on the question of money. Does that make some sense? So I think we're in a situation, and especially Germany right now draws that line because it's the war question. We're in a situation to have a lot of people figure that out. They may not get it on the first pass, but if we say, well, look, you didn't quite understand what I said, and you go back at it a second time, I think people can loosen up enough to get it, especially if they see a way out of this thing. If they see, like we see today, some of the United States coming to its senses. I think the 28 pages are going to have that kind of effect in light of the whole terrorism situation. The question of the FBI, all these kinds of containments, a lot of people have those notions. So it's the same fight in the United States. The cutting edge right now is Germany, because that's the one they're all immediately in the same situation, but that's the one we've got to turn immediately. But people, there's this notion of physical economy versus, like this, every morning we get the reports, the stock market, this, that, and the other thing, that it really is it's like trying to go down to the local gambling casino and say, what does this monopoly money have to do with, producing the bread I eat? It really
Price of tea in China.
it has no connection, right?
Well, a perfect example of physical economy, we will celebrate the anniversary of next week on July 20th, 1969, which was the moon landing, and that's coming up on the 20th of next week, the whole question of the space program. Obviously, how the space program was the driver for a real physical economic basis, that what did it actually take in terms of the productivity in your population to be able to accomplish such a task of taking out Kennedy's vision, carrying out Kennedy's vision, pardon me, of landing a man on the moon and returning safely to Earth. What type of work, productivity had to go into the building of the spacecraft and so forth, and other instrumental machine tools and everything else that went into building this program. So that's just a kind of an example to think about.
Oh,
I don't know if, I'm kind of having trouble understanding some of this stuff here, but I'd like to know, can you say anything about like credit unions, and do they have any more protection? I don't know if this is getting way off the subject, but when I was at my local credit union recently at their board meeting or whatever, they were saying that they used to be more independent, and they're being pushed into a situation where the federal government's wanting to control everything that they do. They're wanting to put somebody over them, and so and try to get them involved in this speculative type of behavior. I was wondering if you had any information on that.
well, a lot of those situations are both avenues of loot. There's the problem is we've waited so long, nothing is really safe, because when it goes, the whole thing's going to go. I was just involved with a discussion with a state representative from Illinois who was put through this bill. They actually passed the bill in Illinois unanimously that we should go with Glass-Steagall, vector credit, everything we're talking about. And then she's got a second bill that's been really dear to her heart. It's where she wants to, and a lot of people are pushing this, let's tax the derivatives, like a Tobin tax, and we can get that money because we know it's there. Now, 20, 30 years ago, we actually were pushing in some elections and things a Tobin tax, where you put a 0.01, well, just you tax, it's like a sales tax on the stock market. Every transaction they make, they got to pay you.
1/10 of 1%.
Yeah. So you could generate a lot of money pretty quickly, but back then, there was a lot of speculation, but there was some real still in the economy. So if you got that tax and you used that to do some functions that were good, you could change it. You still had to fix the whole thing, but you weren't in a desperate situation. Now it's pretty much a diversion. It's a means of sucker people in a wrong fight, because even if you slammed it through tomorrow morning and you had this legal tax that you say we're claiming, it's our money, it doesn't represent anything. It's like part of that $708 trillion of paper that's based on nothing. With Deutsche Bank sitting in the stuff on this book, 55 trillion dollars of, or euros, not dollars, 75 was dollars, euros was 55. Where it's fluff, the only reason they can say it is something is because they don't try to sell it. I could give Belinda a check for $1,000 and she could say, I'm going to go buy Pete, but Pete, you can't, I'll give it to you. Now I want this, this, and this for this, but Pete don't cash it either right now. I'll tell you what you can. And then Pete passes it to Diane, and Diane passes it. Now we've got about $8,000 out here that people have various kinds of things they're claiming is worth something. But if anybody tries to cash it, because I never had the $1,000 in the first place, right? So, and that's what we're sitting here. People are playing. That's what we're living in. And it's the same kind of lunacy when you go to the energy policy or the education policy. We have to take a real deep breath and say, God, if it wasn't for a sane intervention right now, like we're going to pull off in Germany, this is crazy. And then we sit here and we tolerate an Obama in the White House, a functionary for these layers, who is a known killer, a narcissist with a notion that he's got to back Russia and Putin down to outdo Hitler or Napoleon or somebody. I mean, and we sit here as a human species and we say, well, we got some time till November, to tomorrow, whatever. So all these questions, and especially what Linda's drawing on this question of Deutsche Bank, it's got to be moved on now. It's a political decision to wake up and move at these levels. And we're all capable. We may not know all the details, but the details you can get. It's the emotional connection that's real. And that's where the Americans have gotten hit. Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, you can go through the whole history where people have gotten a little panicked, but they're also beginning to realize that it's not so safe in that hole they found. But to answer your question, they're all in trouble. There is no safe place to say, I'm going to stick my money over here, I'm going to put it over there. There's certain things you can do in a physical economy or in an investment in whatever, but the question is, you're not going to solve it unless you solve the whole thing and get a real functioning society back. Because it can crash it, you can lose it, you can get a thermonuclear war, you can lose it, you can die of the being killed by the drug addict next door, any number of things. It's insane until we actually change the whole thing. So we can't back off from that subject. But it's also a doable subject. It's not impossible.
And Lynn used to say that treasuries was a safe place to put your money. But of course now the treasuries of every country are in danger. The bonds.
I keep thinking about, probably off the subject, but I'm thinking about the assassinations themselves, and that certainly does put a damper on things. I mean, if people are getting their cars blown up, you don't want to, you want to kind of go, you don't want to rock the boat if you see how dangerous it is to try to move in a direction. I don't know, I mean, if there's no accountability, anybody can assassinate anybody and there's no accountability. It's so disgusting. I don't see how.
Well, look at the effect of the assassination of Herrhausen on Cole. Like Belinda was saying, he was moving and then immediately stopped, right? Now, Herrhausen was probably under threats as well, and was the quality of individual he fought anyway, Martin Luther King, right?
LaRouche.
Now, you have a situation with the assassination, you get those effects, the same kind of effects on the population. So it's crucial that we, as a political force, like on the 9/11, 28 pages, if people all of a sudden begin to think about it a little bit differently, it's not, boy, this could hit any place at any time like it's doing, but that there's an actual plan behind this. Not every little operative, maybe some of them are, like I said earlier, copycats and whatever, but generally these kind of Manchurian candidates that are unleashed, if they understand that that's got a financial center, it's got a political deployment center, it's got a protection operation in the FBI, right? That you can actually go at a level that isn't moving everywhere and unknown, it's actually a known entity. And you've got some tools like with the bankruptcy reorganization, the prosecution of some of these layers, like Tony Blair is being moved on now, right? You have an ability politically to knock out that top layer. Well, then you can dry up everything else. It's like the dope trade. If you knock out the $800 billion to $1 trillion a year in money laundering, well, it's going to dry up all the way down, especially if you're putting programs in place to change those situations. Right? Now, if you fight it every place it seems to be popping up its head, well, then obviously you're going to probably be identifying yourself and getting hit. If you're part of a movement to beat it at the top, you've got a potential of organizing people. As Lynn said once, you cannot win a war unless you declare war, because you can't get anybody to join you. If you're not fighting that war at a right level to win, then who's going to join you? And that's uniquely what Lynn's been doing. He's been defining that line economically, politically, everything, where you have to fight. And we now have half to 2/3 of the world moving on
Ron, so the Chico, is it pronounced Chico report in England, very exciting, right? Very late, but so is the potential to have a parallel Chico report here exposing the operation behind the invasion of Iraq and all these lies and everything?
28 pages.
It seems like, yeah, right, so it seems like, this is another flank or operation that's doable. You have the 28 pages and these openings.
Yeah, and you've got some of the people that are actually there connected to the Tony Blair investigation, direct parallels into Cheney's operation and the Bush and the Obama operation. So
It's just not as specific as the report. I mean, there was an official report, Chicago report, that's claiming this.
Chilcot.
Chilcot, I didn't know how to pronounce it, Chilcot, okay.
Anthony expansion.
Okay.
yeah, Betty.
Yeah, has anybody read the classified 28 pages yet?
Yes.
What,
Parts
has
of
it been, it's a good cut today?
Yeah, it was released
Yesterday.
yesterday. Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yeah,
I heard that it was going to be there.
the pages were released.
Oh, did they?
Oh, yeah. yes.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you kind of said that fast.
Yeah.
Is it still partly redacted though? I don't know.
Very
Not
little
much, it's just a little bit.
Very little. In any case, it doesn't really matter because the Congress has the whole thing. They own it. They wrote it.
So what, the people who have you read it?
I read it.
Yeah.
What is
Joel, you want to say about something?
Well, he goes through the most important connection is that something like $53,000 a month from the wife of the Saudi ambassador to the guy who was shepherding two of the hijackers in San Diego for a year before 9/11. And he goes through names, amount of money. It also goes through LA, ran a test hijacking from Phoenix to Washington,
Wow.
where the air crew was so upset they landed the plane. FBI investigated and then they didn't do anything. So as Senator Graham said, it pops the cork from the bottle.
Yeah,
So now we
the wine can flow up.
So, and we have a speculation as to, what's gonna happen from here, like, are they gonna take that information and
Well, what we know what should happen and what we're calling for, and I mean, it's actually just a couple of days or not that long before the report was actually declassified, we had put out a petition all over the place that Diane wrote on calling for 4 or 5 specific steps to be taken. The first one was the release of 28 pages. The second one was on actually exposing the operations behind the Al Yamama slush fund deals, the money of the trades between Bandar and the British, and of what was going on in terms of the weapons for oil deals and so forth. Chilcott report in the United States, we call for that. It's the third investigation into the cover-up of by the FBI in these various areas of the continued pages around the hijackings and what happened in terms of in Sarasota, Florida, in Patterson, New Jersey, and these other places, what the FBI role was in it, and then also Bush Obama and their complicity and cover up in it. And then the last thing was to have economic reconstruction in these areas and working with Russia, particularly for building up these areas again that have been war torn. So,
Al Yamama, they were buying all kinds of weapons from the United States, but also from other countries, and they were just arming terrorists and also using those weapons against their enemies in the world.
that's what has to come out.
Yeah, I guess one thing that may happen pretty quick is that they'll read that in front of the Congress. You know, read it into the record so that it's totally available.
You mean the 28 pages?
Yeah.
Oh, so by
It's
reading,
out. It's out on the internet.
Yeah, but it's not in the congressional record.
yeah, to get it in the congressional record is important, yeah. So it's an official.
And as Stephen Lynch said, he says that the release of these pages will create more questions than answers.
All the lines flowing out.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
It's one of these things where you can't put it back in the box. You know, it's like when this first started happening, when this JASTA bill, you know, Justice for against, you know, people who argue about terrorism. And remember, there was a reaction that they fanned in some of these networks that, you know, don't work with LaRouche. He's for the impeachment of Obama. You're going to mess up everything. Stick to the one issue. Leave Obama out of this. And then the administration comes out saying, we're going to veto this in the House. We're going to kill this bill. And what did the population do? The very same networks, I mean, these families, some of who said don't work with LaRouche, they attacked Obama themselves, right? So, right? So it's not that we're going to have to explain to people, this is what you got to do next. They're already moving. It goes back to what Diane brought up about the Berlin Wall. Right? Nobody explained to people that, you know, we're going out here to do this, this, and this. When that young guy who had started those, you know, Monday night sessions got beat up and then died from that, and people came out to his funeral.
Oh, I actually didn't know he died from that. Okay, so that's what
And they-
started it, the candlelight vigils.
Then people start picking up, you know, his role. And so you have a dynamic, you know, we refer to it as a mass strike. Shelley talks about it. There's a phenomena that's of a change in the population. What our task is to make sure it's operating in real time with the real program. And theirs, you really see uniquely lit.
What got the 28 pages released? Because last week I understand that Trump was trying to make that part of the party platform, that he would have those released, and that the Bushes came in at the last minute and got it killed. And then, so what actually got this released? And
About 10 years of our work.
The press conference in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And the threat to get this into just read it into the record like Michael Bell did, Pentagon Papers.
That was key to it. That just a week or so ago, there was a press conference held by the Congress members who've been organizing, well, we've been organizing, and I've been organizing for the release of Glass-Steagall, and they made a different statement. They didn't just say, Mr. President, please release these. They said, if these are not released soon, they're basically threatened, as she just said, to go and read them.
We've memorized, we've been in there, we've memorized huge sections.
Oh, did they say that?
Yeah.
Did they say that?
They can't
If
go
the
in
guys
there
are
without
sponsoring the bill.
Right,
They
they can't take notes.
They have to go under.
But I also wouldn't underestimate the fact that just before that, the Chilcott report had just come out,
Right.
making, exposing Tony Blair as complicit and directly responsible in the crimes around Iraq.
But who signed off on releasing them? Who was the person that made the decision that actually released the documents?
The chair and the sub-chair
Of the intelligence, House Intelligence.
House and Senate.
But just like with the wall in Berlin, it's not just the one guy who controlled the gateway that brought down the Berlin Wall. It was the whole process of beyond the hands-on. It's not the engineer necessarily that crashes the train. You have a whole process involved, so there's, in effect, we can take credit for that, even though we didn't declassify the pages, because no one was talking about this as a fact. It wasn't a political factor in the discussion 10 years ago. Even though 10 years ago, or however many years ago, I mean, right after 9/11, you had all these documentaries come out, one of which Michael Moore had, right, on Fahrenheit 9/11. And even though that was highly partisan in terms of its approach, he even talked about the Saudi role in 9/11. So it wasn't like this. I mean, this stuff is, and if you read the 28 pages, one of the things that's really funny to me about the 28 pages is that most of the information was already public already. I mean, Bob Graham had published it in his book on intelligence failures of 9/11, his book on their commission, and he talked about Omar al-Bayoumi and Hassan al-Baznan, whatever his name was. He talked about these people. I mean, this is stuff that had been leaked. It was already out there.
These people were getting Saudi funding.
Yeah.
You still have the 80,000 pages for.
Yeah, that's just the head of
So
it.
the fight's not over in that
Iceberg,
context. Go ahead.
What I'm confused about, it seems, I got the impression that, I mean, I don't know, I'm interested in the complicity of our government in all of this, and how many of those 19 hijackers, I mean, are some of them just dummy hijackers where they just grabbed a name from somewhere? I mean, maybe those are details I shouldn't be so concerned about, but I don't know. I just think that if they're, apparently some of these people are still alive. They're working as pilots, and they're not going to go to their own government. I talked to a Saudi person. I said, and Saudis tell me they're not allowed to talk about it in their own country in any terms other than the official story. One Saudi told me that, and then another one, they said, oh yeah, we think America did it. It's known in Saudi Arabia that America did it.
Right.
And then,
the
the way the towers came down, like, but we can't say anything about it.
I don't know if people had a chance to ever read through Lynn's discussion with Stockwell the morning it was happening. Have people seen that? We could.
John Stockwell was at the CIA guy?
No, Stockwell is a radio talk show host.
I remember some
Yeah.
CIA.
And LaRouche was scheduled to be on his show as a candidate that morning. So at the top of the hour, Stockwell goes to the news, comes away from the news. Lynn is sitting online waiting to come on, and Stockwell says, my God, LaRouche, you've been saying terrorism is irregular warfare. We got planes hitting buildings. What is going on? That's how Lynn, on the air, found out about 9/11.
At that exact moment, yeah.
Yep, while it was going, the first plane had just hit, and then while they were talking, the second plane hit. And Lynn said, think about this in terms of what I've been talking about, the economic crash, that there's a network that needs, like the Reichstag fire was created, they need a crisis management. And he went on to say, we should better not get caught in naming Osama bin Laden and all this, but he laid out what he'd been laying out for 8 to 9 months before, that the Bush administration and Cheney could not run things except in that crisis management operation. The irony, we were on the streets in Washington, D.C. and other places getting out leaflets laying out this kind of scenario. There had been various incidents in Seattle up on the West Coast where these kind of staged operations were run. So the question on this bigger question of what is it what Lynn measures in terms of these dynamics? So if you look at that and you look at terrorism as irregular warfare, like they locked up Germany when they burned the Reichstag fire, gave Hitler dictatorial powers. So your question about, well, how did they get these individuals to do it? They've got stables of these kinds of things they can pull in. Obviously, that morning, the overall security was down. There was nobody's planes left their particular flight patterns. There weren't F-15s up there, tracking
Weren't
down.
they doing drills? That's what
They
to
were
me.
doing drills.
They were doing drills that were exactly the same thing, so it was confusing. They're saying, is this real world or is this
Right.
simulation?
So obviously, an override on this was in place. So
It's
there's
obvious. I mean,
the difficult thing for people to look at is, do we have a network within the United States that actually is a foreign operation? And obviously, what's come in public is the FBI is that, there's other operations. So the question is the courage to look squarely what it is, and as Lynn has been surgically right. I mean, one thing the American people can admit is that of all the last 20, 40 years, all the lies that they've been given, including the lies they've gotten on LaRouche, they have had a consistent measurement of this correctly and the solutions for them to grab. And they now have to be put on the spot, and they got to do that. We're not going to get everybody, but we got to get enough to turn the whole thing here as well. And that's what Lynn and Helga are going for in Germany. We have a track record there and a history there and all these things, including with Herrhauser and that whole thing. We've got to turn these margins. It can't be, a chaotic collapse. It's got to be, they got to deal with it. We can't let them deal with it. We have to deal with it on our terms. It's like when the Berlin Wall came down, Hanukkah said, this is not going to happen. You come out on the streets, I'll shoot you on the next weekend. So the people did what? They had to think an entire week, and they came out anyway. Right? So I mean, you can go through some of the, but there's a quality of resolve.
There were enough people, there were like over 10,000 people that went into the next demonstration, and the military didn't want to mess with them.
So anyway, we're in that kind of a world, but to measure that world is really, Lynn is the genius of the age on this stuff, and it's not to just he's an old guy that's been right a few times. I mean, if you read through any of these books, it walks you through subjects that do become a bit difficult, but they're understandable. The thing about the human mind is this universe we're talking about, including young people in school being able to conceptualize these kinds of breakthroughs. And whether you're looking at the economy, whether you're looking at education, you're looking at social dynamics, the culture, it's the whole subject of the Schiller Institute. How do we create again a paradigm shift back to this method of thinking? And the human mind is of a form that we can know the universe, and we have to know the universe because it's this rate by which we're applying these things that's really whether we're going to make it or not. In fact, Lynn's got a book on common sense, and the subject is there's survival, and then there's real survival. You can save somebody by pulling them out of the water and they don't drown, but that's not everything involved in survival. What's your life? What's the life of the people in generations after you? And how do we get more and more people who take that up as their sense of identity? And that's what Leibniz was the real core that Lynn points to on his economics, along with Hamilton, who developed that. It's this question of this human identity, the human mind, and that's the real subject. And that's what formed the United States. And we have a situation where we have to bring the United States back to its principles as well. And that's more and more a subject that people want to hear. They just don't know how to go about it yet.
I mean, the whole thing about, what do the officials, how will the officials respond, and will they put through the program and this and that, But when the wall came down in Berlin, that book and many other books that LaRouche had written were found to be translated into Russian and in the program at the universities throughout the Soviet Union.
So, so that kind of fueled the inspiration to.
They came when they found out that LaRouche was in prison. They sent a delegation to go visit him because they still had questions after reading all of his works that had been translated into Russian. And so they came to visit him, and then they inducted him at the first conference after he was released into the group of 100 scientists, top people in Russia.
Wow.
Because there was an opening. They only allow 100
The sad
members.
thing, what's like horrifies me is the propaganda machine that can take. So you're telling me all these neat things. If I try to tell my brother who's an intelligent person, I thought, he'll just get on his cell phone. If I say, oh yeah, I went to the LaRouche meeting, it was very interesting. LaRouche, he's whatever. He's either a communist or he has a pointed hat, was it the KKK, or, all kinds of weird stuff. And I just, like, I don't know, how do you, it frustrates me. I run into so many people like that who don't want to give the time of day to looking beyond anything and looking at any evidence.
They think they don't have any power.
I don't know. I just feel like, what do you do when people just don't want to be bothered with anything? They don't want to be bothered with any details.
You don't change history with the message.
Talk to strangers.
Yeah, there you go. There you
I
go.
talk to my own brother.
No, he said talk to strangers.
Why do you
You'll
talk
give
to
a better.
I
I know. Dr. Brothers.
Yeah, forget
And even
that.
still, some of the strangers like, oh, there's that crazy woman Jackie, stay away from her. Even
That's
the
okay.
strangers are
You'd
worried.
be proud of that. You'd be proud of
But,
that.
I already have that, even though I don't know, I feel like I'm not that wild and crazy. I feel like I try to look at all sides of the thing, and I'm open-minded and try to look at different angles, but I still.
You see, it's really amazing, it's shocking when you look at how much damage they've actually been able to, do to the American population. When I first joined the organization, I wasn't really political. I did start reading some things and try to figure out various things, but one thing that dawned on me, and one of the first times I went out to organize, somebody said, well, how do you know this is true? What are you talking about? And I said, well, for one thing, there's the media and there's this, and I know one thing coherently for myself is they can't both be true. They may both be wrong, but they cannot both be true. But then if you look at various things like the big water projects and the energy project and the solutions, it was really the only place this was being discussed. And so it's like Lincoln was right. You look at the human mind. Lincoln said you can fool some of the people all of the time. And everybody knows that. You can see it. And you can fool all of the people some of the time, and that's happened too. But he also said that third element, right? Remember that? You cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And the reason for that is
Just kill them all.
no. It's because it's a period like this. It's at a period when the situation itself is breaking all the barriers.
Also, LaRouche is almost 94 years old. Okay?
I'm that's
They didn't kill
impressive
him
that
off.
I'm glad that some people are, who are able to get this information out and stay alive, and they realize they're under danger, they're under threat, and, it's just, but.
And the other thing I think is, this is where the whole cultural thing comes in, and humor itself, because you have to actually get around some of these preconceived where they're scared and they're not opening up yet anyway.
Oh, yeah, Joe's watching this online, and he has a question. He says, is there anything to say about the Turkish coup in the context of these revelations?
Say about what?
Turkish coup.
and
Is there anything to say about the Turkish
The
coup
attempted military coup.
in the context?
Do you have an update on that, Tisha?
There's nothing new on the Turkish coup. It's just-
Well, what is the latest? You're saying nothing new in relation to what?
Brian was just checking
Oh.
the website from, this is Kirk Koppler, what's his name?
I hadn't heard of
I
it.
think they lost, didn't they?
They did lose as far as,
that intelligence guy, we Colonel Lang or whatever his name is?
yeah.
Yeah, he has a
It's
blog,
the thing.
and he was saying that his sources are telling him that this was a false flag attempt by Erdogan.
Well, that's the last thing we did here, is that it was a false flag. I think that was on the briefing earlier.
Well, what do you
Yeah.
mean by that? I mean, it was not successful, so we know
Right.
that.
It wasn't successful.
It did not
That's-
succeed,
I
but
think
what
that's
do you
it.
mean?
But again, I think the way to look at
Not
it is
successful.
we'll piece this together as we get more and more. And obviously in all these situations, you're under wartime propaganda. So we've got to sort it out. But if you look at the whole dynamic in Turkey, there's obviously Erdogan's role, there's in the Saudi influence in that. You've got the opposition there. He's dealing with a government, a network in Turkey that doesn't like what he's doing. So there's all kinds of dynamics going on in this bigger question.
Yes,
So,
the Putin and Russia situation
Yeah,
and the
right.
drive for war.
so the question is,
Yeah.
was this legitimate? Did he put it down? Was it an operation he ran so he could lock the situation up like an Reichstag fire? I mean, you got to put all these kinds of things on the table, and not just say I want it to be that or I want it to be that, but what is the actual dynamic going on? And it's rough sometimes when you're dealing with operatives that have been on any number of sides. You know, look in the Philippines, where you have now almost being sent to China, and he was part of the operation that toppled Marcos, right? So who's playing what in the situation now is really measured by these bigger dynamics between the British Empire fight that Lynn is leading the fight against, and all these kind of dynamics. And I think we'll get more as we can verify that it's true.
Right, speculate on these
Yeah.
things.
Because you can, and Lynn is a master on this.
Following this attack in Nice, in France, the president of France is saying we're going to have an emergency lockdown situation for several months. So I mean, if you start to see a pattern of NATO countries or countries that are antagonistic towards the BRICS, even though France isn't necessarily antagonistic towards Russia right now, that the pattern of a move to crisis management at this time, to me, would signal a trying to override any sort of opposition in their countries, which is against this war drive.
That's why I think that's why what Len just put forth is so important, that the Deutsche Bank issue is to stop this war drive. It is the only means that we have for a real solution for peace. If you have a blowout of the system completely, which Deutsche Bank bringing down the whole thing, bringing down the whole house of cards, and you're talking about, as you said, it's a question of the human economy, the real economy, not necessarily saving the speculators, because these guys, you do that, then they lose all power and they can't drive this insane war drive and cause all of these different conflict points and so forth that they're trying to do.
Yeah, a lot of times when Lynn comes back each time and says it's the British Empire, people want to say, well, he's like a broken record on this, but you really have to maintain the focus, because you're not going to figure anything out if you start at a lower level, or at least you make yourself vulnerable to be sabotaged by what they're really doing, because they'll pull you into a fight, which in light of what we have to win is an unwinnable fight. You're never going to resolve that in time. Right? Yeah.
It just made me think of it, since there's a success in opening the 28 pages, could there be a success in going in another maneuver where you want to open the security exchanges files on who did the stock trades, the put options before 9/11. If you could find out who those people were, because apparently that is just,
You want to state that the Saudi, the Saudis are involved in this operation in Nice. That's what Jacques Chirac is putting out.
oh, really? Huh?
So as long as you go easy on the Saudis, this will continue.
So you think it, huh?
Well,
It's
I
just
mean, you're
when-
right
when-
to say Wall Street.
I want to know who's making money. I want to know
Well,
all these
no,
people
no, no,
who
it's not.
place all those bets.
It's Wall Street. Wall Street is the outpost of the British Empire here,
Mhm.
right?
So
So,
again, I know that's at a lower level. I'm getting the middleman instead of the very top.
What you're talking about is what Lynn is saying. Remember, he said on this Deutsche Bank, we're going to set up a committee to deal with this derivative operation. So it's like what the Pecora Commission became also. You know, all those things open up politically if you're actually running it, if you're running the political battle as opposed to somebody else.
you know, the Pecora Commission.
I think we're, tell me.
The Pecora Commission was set up to try the people on Wall Street who had, destroyed the economy.
Huh, no.
Yeah, and they put people in jail.
Huh.
They put, some of the top people in jail.
What were the years of the hearings for the court?
It's 33 years.
33?
32, 33. Yeah, right after.
You see, what Lynn has put in this,
Yeah.
what Lynn has put in this fight on the Deutsche Bank is the 4 laws. It's all there. It's the political fight. It's the reorganization of these guys with this committee. You actually have to bring in a body that represents the nation and citizens to run a bankruptcy reorganization. But you got to create an alternative so you don't go under with the situation. It's like what we got to do with Glass-Steagall. That's why Glass-Steagall is only the first step. You can put through Glass-Steagall tomorrow morning and we'll go under with it.
Right.
So the other steps, the national bank, like we can actually set up the structure here, like Roosevelt did, or like a greenback policy, and then where are you going to put the credit? You have a willful commitment by a nation and its people to follow that kind of leadership and work through that reorganization. And then obviously it's got to be changing the dynamic as you go with these higher technologies. So you got to activate your population at its highest level.
You build the space program and you build the Bering Strait tunnel with the Russians.
And see, so if we force these issues on the emergency on that in the United States as well, imagine if that reality was decided in the United States as well tomorrow morning. Well, part of that is the removal of Obama in an emergency situation. It's immediately dropping a Roosevelt policy into all these cities and gearing it up so the population gets a sense that they're getting part of it. So what would that do to people's outlook in terms of what they're tolerating in the election, right? It's the political fight right now, not some kind of calendar time of what we've got left to deal with this. So it's a fundamental different level of thinking about not only what's going on, but what our role in it is. We've got to create a situation where more and more people have the courage that you were just saying to look at that and not just react, because they're really hysterical, they're acting like infidels. I'm not going to see it. I'm not going to see it. You're crazy. You got to be crazy, because if you were accepted, and that's where the family situation comes in. They believe you on everything, right? Why wouldn't they believe you? Now you're saying this, they can't believe you. You got to be nuts.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah, I mean,
But it's if we look at what changed this week, you look at this challenge we have by Lynn on the Deutsche Bank in terms of getting people to understand that that's crucial to their own lives. They can understand also how we can affect that here. It's the same thing.
I'm gonna make an announcement